Judges 6. We're going to be in Gideon for a little while here, but as I said, not next week. But as we come across this piece, I'm going to divide today into a couple of smaller parts, beginning with, they call Alabama the Crimson Tide. So we'll start here with the Midian Tide. And I call it the Midian Tide because the Midianites did not invade Canaan and stay there. They did not come to live. They just came, Judges 6. They came and went like the tide. So that's why I call them the Midian or Midianite tide. And they were just mean. This was not an invasion that was profitable to the Midianites. I'm not sure why they did this, except that they were just mean-hearted, because they didn't steal crops, they just wrecked them. What a strange thing. Some people are just nasty at heart. So, the people of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. This is not a new sentence. So the Lord gave them into the hands of the Midianites for 7 years. Being who I am, and this is a cross that you have to bear, is that you've got me for a teacher, and I always think about chronology. So we're going to work through the chronology. I apologize. If it really irritates you, let me know. But the one major date in the early part of the Old Testament, there are lots of dates in the end of the Old Testament that are firm and fixed and confirmed with many outside sources. But in the first half of the Old Testament, there is only one really firm date. But it helps us to get everything else. And that one date is this one, that in 966 BC, Solomon, in his 4th year, dedicated the temple in Jerusalem. And Solomon very nicely tells us that it was 480 years after the Exodus. So now we have a simple math problem, and we have a great couple of dates. So 480 prior to 966 is 1446 BC. If I have not told you this before, I'm going to tell it to you until you get it, until you start raising your hand before I get to it. And that is, the Charlton Heston movie about Moses has the wrong Pharaoh. Okay? Now you gasp, but that's why I got to tell you over and over and over again. So they're 200 years off because of a critical version of reading the Bible that puts Moses much closer to the present day than the text actually tells us. But I helped to remember who the correct Pharaoh is with a rhyme. Does anybody remember it? It goes like this. In 1492, the Pharaoh's name was Thutmose II. In 1446 BC, that's the Exodus, the Pharaoh's name was Thutmose III. So Thutmose III, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Biblical dates don't change. The dedication of the temple is 966. The date of the Exodus is 1446. But Egyptian chronology is a little bit wishy-washy because those Egyptian pharaohs sometimes got mad at each other and they wiped out each other's names from the record. And so an archaeologist will suddenly discover there was a pharaoh in between these two guys. And then they have to, so the whole chronology changes. But most of that's still being discovered happens after this. So this is a pretty fixed, firm date that Thutmose, and by the way, Thutmose III's tomb is one of the most informative tombs of all of the pharaohs because he's the one who lists the names of all of the, is it 300 and some gods of Egypt? So words and pictures, and if you're curious, it's there in his tomb. Last time I think I mentioned, just last week, King Tut died. It's a strange sentence to say out loud, but so Tut was run over by a chariot. It seems that the pathologists have figured that out. I should bring in that copy of Biblical Archaeology Review and let you read it. Very interesting. And there was a Nova, the TV show on PBS, Nova. There was a whole episode on this also, where they keep reenacting the runover again and again, like they're rubbernecking or something. Like, stop showing it. It's like, remember when the Challenger exploded and we had to watch it on TV for just like the Trade Center, falling and so forth. And so, all right, the Exodus followed 40 years later by the death of Moses. He was 120 years old. Scholars are pretty well agreed that the initial Exodus under Joshua lasted about 7 years, and that Joshua would have died around 1396, maybe a couple years later, but he was 110 years old. Do you see I gave him 3 years of retirement before he died? So, can you imagine being 107 and finally getting to retire? Do you know the story of Pastor Hinnenthal here? Some of you may know Bob Hinnenthal. His grandfather was pastor here at St. Paul's way back in the World War II days. And when old Pastor Hinnenthal was getting quite elderly, very hard to walk, going deaf, going blind, he asked and begged the congregation in writing for permission to retire, and the council would not give him permission to retire. And he was having trouble getting up and down the steps to give communion and things like that, and he was getting quite elderly, and finally they gave him permission to retire, and he died within maybe a month. And then they gave his poor wife a week to get out of the parsonage. We did not treat her well. That is a black moment in St. Paul's history. There are maybe 2 or 3 of those, and that's a really nasty one. The way that we treated those, both Pastor and Mrs. Hinnenthal, not very nice. We no longer take a vote. Can you imagine voting on whether your pastor takes a call or not? They used to do that, though. Can you imagine you don't want to take the call, but the congregation votes that you should? Oh. I was considering the vacation I'm about to take, and Pastor Scharf reminded me, a congregation with a good pastor will think that he deserves 3 weeks of vacation every year, and a congregation with a bad preacher will think that they deserve 3 weeks of vacation every year. So take your vacation. That was Pastor Scharf's advice to me. I didn't ask him which one he thought I was, but I was glad to hear those words. So Joshua dies. Then the book of Judges begins with that oppression by Cushan Rishathaim and Othniel, the first judge. Not quite 10 years after the death of Joshua, but then there's peace for 40 years. Remember, the peace in intervals in the book of Judges seem to be multiples of 20, 40, or 80 years, something like that. Then there is the oppression by Moab, followed by Ehud, the left-handed man. I'm trying to help you study up for the quiz we're going to have. So I always say, the left-handed man after Eglon. You laugh, but I bet you would do well. Ehud kills Eglon, loses his sword, and there's 80 years of peace. Following that, I don't have a date for Shamgar, have no idea, but Deb, and not you, Deb, but this Deborah and Sisera. Afterwards, there's a 40-year peace, and now Midian is oppressing the land. Is the screen in an okay spot? Okay. And then we have Gideon, this judge. It's after 6 or 7 years of oppression, so it takes us to around 1207. My math is wrong, isn't it? Should be 1206. Okay. Deal with it. I'm sorry about that. And then if I kick the dedication off of the temple, we get to another fixed date, which is about 100 years later. Jephthah, who's the next major judge, will make a speech in which he mentions 300 years since we've been in Canaan. So doesn't 1106 match up with 1406? as 300 years in the land of Canaan. So do you see how that date works in the chronology also? So this is how this kind of all plays out. So anyway, we're one verse in, and we're trying to work out some of the chronology. If you need a minute, I'm perfectly okay with that. Well, a couple people also came in late and didn't get the candy. They're little butterbeer things. They're very hot. Are they really beer? No, they're just like Oh, you want one, man? Sure. Mark, you guys? Here, I'll ask you to pass it down, and then I'll come get it later. Did you guys get it, guys?
Yes, we did.
Oh. Okay. Was that enough time for you to fill in stuff that you would care about? Okay, go on. Okay. All right. So, the power of Midian was very oppressive to Israel. So because of this, the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, in the, forgive me, something or others, and in the strongholds. The Hebrew word here is not easy to translate. It's not the usual word you would find. But there is a word in Arabic that's very similar to it that means the kind of depression or gouged out area that like a sudden rush of water will make in the sand. And so maybe some kind of a cave or something like that, a little hiding place. But I've translated here mountains, caves, and strongholds. And this is one of the Dead Sea caves looking out over the Dead Sea that you're looking at right now you're on the inside looking out. If we were on the outside looking in, it would look more like this. That's pretty oppressive. This is Qumran. The whole region is filled with high caves like this. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden. Sometime in the late 1st, early 2nd century A.D., after the destruction of Jerusalem, it would seem that one of the sects of Jewish almost extremists, the monks of Qumran, the Essenes possibly, squirreled away copies of the Old Testament. And it was discovered in 1947. A Bedouin boy, a teenager, was following a lost kid, I believe it was a baby goat, who had scrambled up into one of these caves. And being a teenager, he didn't feel like crawling all the way up there, and he threw a rock. And he heard, instead of the clink clink of he heard a crunch, crash, like dishes breaking. And it was a piece of pottery breaking. And he went in there, he climbed up then to find out what had happened. He found the goat, and he found a roll of leather. And then he found a couple of other jars and found out that some of them had leather too. Some of them also had scrolls of papyrus and a bunch of just old fragments that had sort of disintegrated. Some people don't call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. They call them the Dead Sea Scraps. That's kind of all that's left. And but he took the 4 that he found that were in pretty good shape, put them in a bag, and tied them around the outside of the pole of his tent. And they sat there for about a month that spring. That was the spring or the winter of 47. Meanwhile, back in the United Nations, Lord Balfour thought it would be a great idea if all of the Jews who had just been so oppressed by the Nazis in World War II would go back to Palestine and live, even though Palestine was the home of 1 million or so Palestinians who had been there without Jews for about 1,000 years. The Jews had not lived in Palestine since before the Crusades, not in large groups. And so that didn't go over too well. The UN thought it would be great. Nobody else did. And I'm still kind of up in the air about was this a good idea or not, but the war is still happening today. So, but the war began, and these leather scrolls got sort of taken in a little adventure to a cobbler, and then to an antiquities dealer named Kondo in the outskirts of Jerusalem, I think, or Bethlehem, and who recognized them for what they were really worth, and of course paid the kid as if it was just leather, and then had these, and then asked him where he got them, and found a bunch more. And then during the war, there wasn't much that they could do, but the first 4 scrolls were published, or not published, they were announced, and a team was assembled to work on these things, and found out that they were biblical scrolls. I have seen the Great Isaiah Scroll and some other pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls in person. I took a group of St. Paul's members up to the Twin Cities to see an exhibit maybe 10 years ago or so. And I got to see the Isaiah Scroll the only time it's been out of Israel. It was in Chicago at the museum there, and Professor Eichmann took a bunch of us students to go see it while it was in the U.S. I still can't believe that they flew that thing over the ocean to come to the U.S., but they did, just once, and it's never come out again. But now my son Peter has seen many of the scrolls also in person there in Israel. But I do remember that the time I went, when they were on exhibit in the Twin Cities, I had just preached on a certain psalm. I think it was Psalm 62, and there it was. The fragment that was there was that psalm. And I'm standing there with my son. I remember John Oppitz was with me, but Benjamin was with me and a few others. And I'm looking at it, and John Oppitz didn't think much of the exhibit. He thought, these are tiny little pieces. It's not that big of a deal. And I read it, though. I had just done the sermon on the thing. I knew the Hebrew. And then I mentioned a few things about it. I was talking through the significance of a find like this, because it's the earliest copy of the whole Old Testament also dates to the time of the Crusades, just a little bit before, around 800 or 900 A.D., the only complete copies of the Old Testament. So these fragments from 1,000 years earlier are quite important, because by and large, there's no difference. That tells us a lot. And so as I was talking through this with my son and with John Oppitz, and I forgot who else was standing with us at that moment, I turned around. I thought there was nobody else in the room. And there were 40 people behind us listening, because they didn't have a tour guide. You're just on your own with, do we have earpieces or something like that you went around with? And they're all like, how do you know this? And I said, well, I'm a pastor, and I have a master's degree in biblical languages, and I'm doing this. And then they started following me around, and so but Benjamin wanted to go see the dinosaurs, so he went and saw the dinosaurs, and so they kind of stopped following me then, and that was kind of fun. But Qumran Caves, all right. Whenever the Israelites planted seed, the Midianites and Amalekites and other people of the east would invade and attack them. So invading, that's why I call it the Midianite tide, because they just come in at planting season, and they would make camp and destroy the crops, even all the way to Gaza, which is on the coast. And they would leave nothing for Israel, not a sheep or an ox or even a donkey. So they just stole and then moved and then went back. Came in and stole and then went back. So like the tide. For they would invade with their livestock and their tents, as many as a swarm of locusts. Neither they nor their camels could be counted. They laid their land waste whenever they invaded. So they just came in and wrecked everything and stole and left. And they did not have Mauser rifles, but anyway, you get the idea. But can you imagine, though, you're on foot, you're hoeing your garden, and these guys come in on camels with swords and spears and even just clubs, and what did my ancestors use? Shillelaghs and things like that, just to beat people up with. You all know what shillelaghs are? It's a walking stick that you can use as a club. So it's what every good Irish farmer would have. You could move that lamp if you want to. it bothers me when I sit there, so you can, or if it's a pillow, you can just lean back on it, and that'd be okay too. Poor Sarah. Okay. So Israel was brought down very low because of Midian, and the Israelites cried to the Lord for help. They had cried to the Lord before. They cried the first time, and the Lord sent them. Remember the first judge's name? Judge O. Right, Aelhofen. No, Othniel. Exactly. Very good. And then they cried out again, and the Lord sent the left-handed man, who was Ehud. Yeah. And then Shamgar, the minor guy, and then the Lord sent them Barak, who went and grabbed Deborah because he was chicken, right? And now they cry out again, and who will the Lord send? When the Israelites cried to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet. A prophet? Weren't they looking for a judge? Well, maybe that by this time, 100 years in or so, to the time of the judges, maybe that's the problem. They're not looking to the word of the Lord. They are looking to some other deliverance. So the Lord sends them a prophet instead of a judge to begin with. He sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." The prophet, does he prophesy anything in the future? No. He gives them a history lesson of what just happened. I brought you here. Don't forget that. I snatched you away from the power of Egypt and from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me. You can kind of see all of the leaders of the Israelites with their hands behind their backs kind of go like whistling, like, oh yeah, somebody worships these Amorite gods, right? You know, not wanting to say that, I've got 4 in my kitchen and that kind of a thing, but yeah. So, what else would this prophet say? He proclaims the law. What should come next? He leaves. This is all we hear from this prophet. You dummies, you forgot that. Well, actually, he began with gospel. I brought you out of Egypt. But they're thinking he's going to say more, but he doesn't. Instead, we have this thing that I call the meeting at the oak. In the Bible, up to this time, we don't have a lot of landmarks. And so our authors, Moses and the guy who wrote Joshua and the guy who wrote Judges, they tend to give us landmarks that are, if they're not mountains, although even the mountains don't really have consistent names yet, rivers, right, like the Kishon, and trees. Sometimes a cave, but trees. Remember Abraham? There was a big oak at Mamre, and Deborah had what kind of a tree that she judged underneath? You remember? It was like Gilligan's Island. It was a palm tree, sure, yeah. And now there's a meeting at this oak. Do you know that in New Ulm there's an oak that dates back to the founding of the city? It's over that away. The story goes that in those founding years in the 1850s, the Lakota Sioux who were around here didn't like the idea of people putting up stakes, and they would yank out the stakes when they were trying to measure off the city. And so the city actually decided this tree is one of the boundary, and you measure off the tree. And that oak is still standing. It's over not that far from, it's now, the new church moved in. It's where the United Church of Christ used to be. And what denomination has that now? The Grace Community Church is there. Yes, thank you. But it's over there. There's this oak that is at least 150, more like 200 or more years old. But it's, we should cut it down and count the rings. Sorry, I didn't say that. All right. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, So Abiezer would have been the village or the family, but it seems like it's a region later in the text. So Ophrah also in the neighborhood, and his son Gideon was threshing wheat there in a winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Usually, when you thresh wheat, you would thresh on top of a hill so the wind would blow away the chaff. As you crush the hulls with maybe a threshing sledge that you might pull if it's a small harvest, or you might have a team of oxen pull it if it was a big harvest. And then Jesus also reminds us, do not muzzle the ox while he is treading the grain. Paul quotes that as a reminder that the worker is worth his wages. And so Gideon here, though, isn't threshing wheat on a hill. He's threshing wheat in a little depression somewhere, because a wine press would be on a level place so that out of the wine press, then through a little channel, it would go down to where you would have your jugs and stuff and catch the wine and so forth. And so he's doing this, though, to hide it from the Midianites. So it looks like it's a kind of a pitiful harvest. He's actually harvested something, though. That's impressive. So a couple things here. He actually did harvest something. He's got an innovative, creative way of doing it. He's used to kind of thinking outside the box. This is maybe a kind of guy that the Lord will use. Maybe the Lord gave him these gifts specifically for that reason, so he could be useful to him. So Gideon is doing this. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said, and we're not told that, in fact, Gideon doesn't seem to recognize him as an angel. He treats him more like a visitor. Like when Abraham saw the three guys show up, and one is the Lord and two are angels, and he just treats them like men. So he treats them with dignity and respect, but he doesn't talk like it's God. But the Lord says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord's with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about? They would say, didn't the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hands of Midian." So he just complains to this wanderer. Is it Hebrews? Yes, Hebrews that tells us some have entertained angels without realizing it. Yeah, be careful how you treat strangers and things like that. We should remember that more often when we have guests walk in. You've been listening to Invisible Church, the Bible study podcast from St. Paul's Lutheran Church, New Ulm, Minnesota.